Sanctum of suffering. The old Victorian building of Greywood Asylum stood ominously against the overcast sky, a brooding presence in the middle of a desolate moorland. Its stone walls, darkened by decades of grime and neglect, seemed to exhale a cold breath that sent shivers down the spines of those who dared approach. Far removed from the nearest town, Greywood had become a place where society's unwanted and misunderstood were tucked away, out of sight and out of mind. Inside, the corridors echoed with a cacophony of anguished cries and the dull thud of heavy doors slamming shut. The patients, a mix of the mentally ill and those who were simply inconvenient to society, were treated with disdain by the staff. The doctors and nurses saw them not as people, but as subjects to control and manipulate, often resorting to humiliation and cruelty under the guise of treatment. Dr. Harold Foster, the head psychiatrist, was the worst of them all. Tall, gaunt, and perpetually shrouded in a cloud of cigar smoke, he moved through the asylum with an air of superiority. His methods were unorthodox, his demeanor cold and detached. Patients would tremble at the sound of his approaching footsteps, the sharp clack of his shoes on the linoleum floor, a precursor to their torment. In room 13, Sarah, a young woman with a fragile mind, huddled in the corner. Her long, dark hair hung in tangled strands over her face. Once vibrant and full of life, she now resembled a ghost of her former self. Her eyes, wide and haunted, darted around the room, constantly searching for an escape from the horrors inflicted upon her. Dr. Foster had taken a particular interest in Sarah, subjecting her to countless sessions of electroshock therapy and cold water treatments. Across the hall in room 22, an elderly man named Thomas sat in a wheelchair, his body broken by years of neglect and abuse. He was often left for hours, sometimes days, without food or water, his cries for help ignored. The staff delighted in tormenting him, taking pleasure in his suffering. Nurse Kelly, a stout woman with a permanent scowl, was especially cruel. She would slap him for the slightest infraction, her face contorted with sadistic glee. In the basement, where the air was thick with mildew and despair, the asylum's darkest secrets were hidden. This was where the most troublesome patients were sent, never to be seen again. The screams that echoed through the stone walls were a constant reminder of the horrors that lay beneath. Chains and shackles hung from the walls, remnants of a time when the asylum's methods were even more barbaric. It was in this place of torment that a seed of rebellion began to grow. The patients, beaten down but not broken, started to whisper among themselves. In the dead of night, they plotted their escape, their minds sharp with a newfound clarity born from desperation. They knew that their only chance of survival lay in overthrowing their captors, turning the tables on those who had tormented them for so long. The night of the uprising arrived, shrouded in a dense fog that wrapped around Greywood like a shroud. The asylum was eerily silent, the usual din of suffering replaced by an uneasy calm. Dr. Foster sat in his office, oblivious to the impending chaos, his focus on the glass of whiskey in his hand. Nurse Kelly and the other staff members moved through the halls, performing their nightly rounds with a sense of boredom and routine. The patients struck with a coordinated ferocity that took the staff by surprise. Sarah, leading the charge, had somehow managed to procure a set of keys. She moved through the halls like a wraith, unlocking doors and freeing her fellow inmates. Thomas, despite his frailty, found the strength to rise from his wheelchair, his eyes burning with a fierce determination. Chaos erupted as the patients swarmed the corridors, their pent-up rage exploding in a violent frenzy. The staff, caught off guard, scrambled to defend themselves, but they were quickly overwhelmed. Dr. Foster, hearing the commotion, stumbled from his office, his eyes widening in horror as he realized the gravity of the situation. Sarah was the first to reach him. She stood before him, her small frame trembling with rage. "You will pay for what you've done," she hissed, her voice filled with a venomous intensity. Dr. Foster backed away, his face pale, but there was nowhere to run. The patients closed in around him, their faces contorted with anger and hatred. Nurse Kelly was dragged screaming from her post, her cries for mercy falling on deaf ears. The patients showed her no compassion, no empathy, just as she had shown them. Her fate was sealed as they exacted their revenge, her screams echoing through the halls. In the basement, the patients found the instruments of their torment and turned them against their captors. The chains and shackles that had once bound them now served as tools of retribution. The staff who had once wielded power with such cruelty now found themselves at the mercy of those they had oppressed. Dr. Foster was dragged down to the basement, his struggles futile against the sheer force of the enraged patients. They bound him to a chair, his wrists and ankles secured with the same restraints he had used on them. His eyes darted around the room, his mind racing as he tried to comprehend his impending fate. "You thought you could break us," Sarah said, her voice cold and detached. "But you underestimated our will to survive." She stepped forward, a glint of madness in her eyes, and reached for the electroshock equipment. Dr. Foster's eyes widened in terror as he realized what was about to happen. "No, please," he begged, his voice trembling. "You don't understand. I was only trying to help." Sarah's laughter was harsh and mirthless. "Help? You call this help?" She gestured to the room, to the instruments of torture that surrounded them. "No, Dr. Foster, you were feeding your own sick desires, and now it's time for you to experience what we've endured." The first shock hit him like a bolt of lightning, his body convulsing violently as the electricity surged through him. The pain was excruciating, unlike anything he had ever felt. He screamed, a primal sound that echoed through the basement, but there was no mercy to be found. The patients watched with grim satisfaction as he writhed in agony, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the malfunctioning bulbs. Upstairs, the asylum had descended into a nightmarish landscape of blood and vengeance. The staff were hunted down, one by one, their pleas for mercy ignored. The patients reveled in their newfound power, their minds twisted by years of abuse and suffering. They had become the monsters that Greywood had sought to contain, their humanity eroded by the relentless cruelty they had endured. Thomas, despite his frail body, found a strength he never knew he possessed. He cornered Nurse Kelly in one of the treatment rooms, her back against the wall, her face a mask of terror. "Please," she whimpered, "I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Thomas spat, his voice filled with venom. "Your job was to care for us, to help us heal. Instead, you took pleasure in our pain." He picked up a syringe from the nearby tray, its needle glinting in the dim light. "Now you will know what it's like to be at the mercy of someone else." He plunged the needle into her arm, the sedative taking effect almost immediately. She slumped to the floor, her eyes wide with fear. Thomas stood over her, his breath ragged, his body trembling with rage and exhaustion. "This is for every slap, every insult, every moment of suffering," he said, his voice breaking. "This is for all of us." As dawn broke, the asylum was eerily quiet. The fog had lifted, revealing the true extent of the night's carnage. The staff lay scattered throughout the building, their bodies broken and bloodied. The patients, their rage spent, wandered the halls in a daze, their eyes vacant and hollow. Sarah stood in the courtyard, the cold morning air biting at her skin. She looked up at the sky, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the clouds. She felt a strange sense of peace, a calm she had not known in years. The nightmare was over, but the scars would remain forever. Greywood Asylum, once a place of unspeakable suffering, now stood as a testament to the horrors that had taken place within its walls. The outside world would eventually learn of the uprising, of the bloodshed and chaos that had ensued. But for the survivors, there would be no return to normalcy. Their minds were forever marked by the horrors they had endured, their spirits broken, but not defeated. In the end, Greywood became a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered among the townsfolk. But for those who had lived through it, it was a reminder of the darkness that lurked within the human soul and the terrible price of unchecked cruelty.